Okay, we are going to begin a study in the Gospel of Luke, but I want to tell you what I'm doing because I'm not going to do the usual type of Bible study. This past month, I have really spent a lot of time reading and reflecting and putting pieces together that I haven't put together in this way before, and also deciding to go ahead and take a stand on certain positions that I'll be mentioning here coming up, that I've not taken a particular stand on before. So as we enter into this, one of the things that I want to do is to build a reading of the Gospel of Luke that has essentially three legs to it. The first leg we've already laid out last year in this understanding of Revelation. The Trinity is our hermeneutic. The fourfold Christological approach that allows us to live with the ambiguities with great confidence. And these kinds of things I've set up in that particular frame for us to think about. The second is the mimetic theory. The mimetic theory's distinction between religion and revelation, which is also to be found in Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and in some senses in Jürgen Moltmann, and in another kind of alternative sense in the views of Wolfhart Pannenberg. And then the third leg is the historical critical. Now, we're going to be discussing the historical critical tonight, this portion of it, because I have a number of things I want to say about the historical critical method. And in particular, it's the way it has been used. So the first thing we have to do when we come into gospel studies is recognize that there are differences between the gospels. These differences, and they've been approached in primarily three different ways, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. We're going to follow David Dungan's work at that point. But these three different ways of dealing with the differences in the Gospels have produced three different ways of reading the Gospels. Now, Dungan, in his book, where's Dungan? His book is titled A History of the Synoptic Problem. It's a phenomenal book. It's an excellent book, well worth reading. In this book, Dungan points out that there are really four interrelated issues that one has to recognize that one is dealing with when one comes to this issue of the synoptic problem. That is, the differences and the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One of these is to establish the best text, the best underlying Greek text. The second has to do with the actual composition of that text. That is, in the early church, who wrote it, to whom was it written, when was it written, these kinds of questions. The third has to do with the canonization of that text. That is, how was this text, after it was written, how was it received in the early church? And then lastly, Dungan also says the category of hermeneutics. How do we interpret this text or these texts? Okay, so you have text, the establishment of a Greek text, composition, canonization, and hermeneutics. All four belong together. And Dungan points out that already by the end of the 2nd century, the church father Origen is the only church father to deal with all four of these particular questions together. Others will ignore one or the other. They'll either ignore the establishment of the best text, or they'll ignore the composition, or they'll ignore the questions of canonization or hermeneutics. But at some point, Origen is the only one to bring all four of these together. And what's really intriguing about this is that, as Duncan points out, from that point on, nobody else has done this. And it becomes, when you just think about the logic of it, it makes all the sense in the world. And so we have this early Christian scholar in Origen who's dealing with the difficulties in the text of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because these very same difficulties, these contradictions, were being used by the Greek philosophers and arguers against the Christian tradition already from the early part of the 2nd century forward. In other words, the critics of Christianity read the Gospels and they paid careful attention to them, and they noticed these contradictions and they brought them up. And the early church fathers had to wrestle with these particular issues in contradiction. Now, one of the ways that, and it's fundamentally the first way to deal with this, is to take all four Gospels and produce a harmony. And that's the way of Augustine. Now, it had already been attempted in the 2nd century and quite successfully in the East by Tatian, who was a disciple of Justin Martyr in Rome. Tatian combined all four Gospels into one narrative. It's called the Dia Tesseron. And if you Google Dia Tesseron, Diatesseron, Dia Tesseron, if you Google it, you can actually find an old English translation of it. There are much better translations available for purchase, of course. But Tatian, already around the year 180, around the same time Irenaeus was writing his book against heresies, Tatian is dealing with these difficulties in the Gospels by creating one narrative, one giant long narrative. This was picked up by Augustine, and Augustine would create the first harmony of the Gospels, that is, where everything was fitted together. The problem with this is, as the modern attempts at gospel harmonies recognize, is that you have Peter betraying Jesus twice. You have two cleansing of the temples, one at the beginning, one at the end of the ministry. You have things that just don't work, okay? They're still contradictions. No matter how you slice it or dice it, they're still there. John Calvin came along and produced a harmony of the Synoptic Gospels. And then finally, in our own day, the conservatives and others, that's my phone ringing. I'm going to ignore it. Thank you, Richard. It's over there on vibrate and it's annoying me. I apologize. At any rate, we have in the modern era harmonies being produced in the conservative tradition. Now I have a friend who has done his own, in a sense, Dia Tesseron, and it's called The Single Gospel. And Neil Everett has, this is by Whipfenstock, same publisher that publishes my books. And Neil has had sent me the review copy and asked for my commentary if I'd be willing to do a back cover blurb. And I told him, honestly, I can't. I don't think that you can weave all four gospel narratives together into one text as though it's one story. I think it's very, very important that that we have these four stories of Jesus told from different perspectives, okay? And we've talked about that a lot last year and the importance of these perspectives bring. Now, any New Testament aficionado worth their salt is going to want to create some kind of view of early church history. That is, when you read your Bibles and you open them up and it says the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke was written by Luke, Paul's companion in the book of Acts, around the year 80, probably somewhere in Asia Minor, right? Okay. That, my friends, is hooey. That's the polite way to say it. The fact is, of the authorship of the four Gospels, Mark, the attribution of Mark being John Mark, the companion of Paul and of Peter, has the greatest strength as a writing that can be attributed to a known figure, but he's not an apostle. Luke, when it comes to Luke, who's also not an apostle, there is, I think, a lesser certainty that Luke, the companion of Paul, wrote the Gospel and the book of Acts, although in my view, I'm still on the side of those who, I'm sitting on the fence, let me put it that way, but I still think that's a possibility, although more and more I'm beginning to wonder if we're dealing with the same Luke, but probably, I think. At this point, I'm just going to kind of go with that. When it comes to Matthew, Matthew, I think, has been misattributed. Certainly, it wants to be an apostolic document, and it's early on attributed to St. Matthew. It's possible that Matthew is the author or the editor or the inspiration behind that text. And of course, the Zebedean authorship for the Gospel of John, I think, is completely fiction. If no other alternative can be found, then we'll just leave it as the beloved / unnamed disciple. But that writing would be apostolic. That is, we have someone who was with Jesus from the beginning, starting with John the Baptist. So Matthew and John, Matthew and John are claiming apostolic authorship. Mark and Luke is not a claim for apostolic authorship. However, in the early church, there is a church father by the name of Papias, and he wrote an exposition in 5 volumes, an exposition on the sayings of the Lord. Now, Papias preferred oral tradition to written text. That was his preference. He preferred to hear something about Jesus from someone who either was apostolic or who knew the apostles. That is, he would only pay attention to stuff that came down through that particular channel. And he collected these sayings and he wrote an exposition. He didn't seem to be a fan of the written Gospels. And he notes, it's Papias that notes in this rather argued over paragraph that's found in Eusebius, that when it comes to John Mark, the editor of the Gospel of Mark, he didn't do a very good job. It's just kind of strung together. And then Papias goes on to talk about Luke, and but for Papias's view, even the written text of Mark is not worthy. It doesn't quite stand up. But he would have been a more peripheral or edgy voice. The mainstream of Christendom would have taken the Gospels into their communities, in particular their worship, where they were read in worship. And these Gospels weren't called Gospels yet. In 150, Justin Martyr refers to these texts as the memoirs of the apostles. And he uses a term that's common in the ancient world, that we're dealing here with, in a sense, a biography. Okay, not in the modern sense, but in the ancient sense. And so these memoirs are in this time period, in this time frame, being debated as to their use in the churches, but they aren't the only books being debated or used. There's a plethora of books being used in early Christian churches, both Jewish and I'm talking Jewish Hebrew scriptures and pseudepigraphal texts, apocryphal pseudepigraphal texts being used in Jewish Christianity and in Christianity as it's emerging into the 2nd century. There's another plethora of texts being written and used in the churches. For example, the Didache would have been used in the East, in Syria. There's a reason it's not used in the West. We'll come to that. The Shepherd of Hermes would have been recognized as canonical in some places, but not others. There are those books which are accepted, those books which are disputed, and those books which are rejected. That comes later. It's at this stage that they're still sorting all this out. And that's why the Gnostics can have such a field day in the 2nd century, and why you get this explosion of apocryphal legends about Jesus beginning to develop in the 2nd century and eventually written down in these other gospels. The church is still trying to sort out which gospels contain the information that is recognized as authoritative, as apostolic, as true. Now, as we make our way again into the 2nd century, and the church has now basically accepted Matthew, Mark, and Luke. By the time you get to 180 in certain areas around the Mediterranean, that's pretty solid. It's certainly solid in Justin Martyr in Rome in 150. So Rome would have been one of the earlier places to actually come bring those together. We find out by 180 the Gospel of John up in what is now France. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, he includes the 4th gospel. And so now from his perspective, we have everything complete. The number 4 is a whole number, 4 winds, 4 directions, this kind of thing. You would almost think I'm sorry, Irenaeus was a bit of a Native American in that sense, because they do a lot of that stuff. But now you've got the Gospel of John included. And once that happens, and it's already in a sense locked in by the time we get to the end of the 2nd century, we now have major issues trying to connect all 4 of these gospels into a single flowing narrative. And that's what Origen recognized. That's what Tatian and Augustine tried to kind of paper over with their harmonies of the gospels. So synoptic problem solution number 1 is Origen. We put all the manuscripts together. We look for the best text. We look at the composition. We look at the history. We look at the canonization, the authorization by the churches. And then we look at the hermeneutics, the way we're going to interpret these texts. They all belong together. Augustine eliminates, in his approach, he eliminates the text question because he's got the Latin Vulgate. Augustine doesn't read Greek. Augustine assumes that it's the Latin Vulgate that's just fine. He does deal a little bit with composition, but he follows mainline tradition at that point. He does deal a little bit with canonization, using the similar arguments as Irenaeus and some of the other fathers. And he does deal with the issue of hermeneutics, which for both himself and Origen was allegorical. Now, the third solution to the synoptic problem didn't arise until the 1600s. And that's the beginnings, the very, very beginnings of what will become the historical critical method. Now, we are pushing almost 400 years, let's say certainly 350 years of the historical critical method's use. And I have two things I want to say about this right at the get-go. Number one, in our world, in order for us to have discourse with the use of Holy Scripture outside of the context of the church, we have to be able to use the historical critical method. There's just no doubt that that's essential if we're going to have any dialogue outside of the church, because the universities and the seminaries use the historical critical method. They train their clergy and their college students and their university students in it. And so anybody that takes a religion class will learn the issues around the problems in the gospel text. And that's what the historical critical method essentially does. It problematizes the text. This is one of the extraordinary pieces of Dungan's work in the history of the synoptic problem, is he's able to trace back this particular way of approaching the Gospels to a Jewish philosopher, Baruch Spinoza. Some of you are familiar with Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza was a Jew. He ended up being persecuted, and his family was persecuted. And so he's trying to figure out how this religion, which is so certain of its reading of things, could persecute Jews. And so he comes to the Gospels. He says, look, there's all these problems. And the way we're going to solve them is to seriously problematize the problems. And he begins asking all sorts of questions that are now very much questions that we all still ask. But he problematized the text. And when he problematized the gospel text, now the church has to reply. Because for the church, and this is the Catholic Church and the emerging Protestants, they're only about 100 years old at this point, what the church has to do, both Catholic and Protestant, is defend the veracity of Holy Scripture against this emerging problematizing of these texts. The Protestants lock into a theory of inspiration. The Catholics lock into tradition, and that tradition goes all the way back to Augustine. Matthew was written first, Luke came second, and Mark was a summary of Matthew and Luke, and then the Gospel of John. And Catholic scholars, even until today, when they are teaching, they are required to say this is what the church teaches, even if they write their commentaries and they teach their classes arguing Mark was the first gospel or whatever. They're still obligated to Matthean priority, okay? The Protestant tradition, and this is where it gets really, really curious, is a tradition which seeks to undermine the authority of Rome. And so when we get to the mid-19th century, there's going to be a conclave that will happen in the 1870s known as Vatican I, okay? And that's where the infallibility of the Pope is proclaimed. Now, why at that point is the infallibility of the Pope proclaimed? Because the church's traditional view had been virtually decimated by a view that arose in the first part, from the 1800s through this period of Markan priority. Mark was first. And Matthew used Mark and something else. And Luke used Mark and something else. The reason this was important is it upends Matthean priority and thus allows the Protestant tradition to come in and say, okay, those words about Peter that you find in Matthew about I'm going to make you, Rocky, the head of my church and all that stuff that's added later. It's non-historical Jesus stuff. And that kind of thinking is going to undermine the Catholic view of biblical authority according to their tradition And so they are locked into the so-called infallibility and inerrancy of the Pope, just as the Protestants lock themselves into the infallibility of the biblical text. Now, since that time, the historical critical method has gone through scores of permutations. And the synoptic problem itself has gone through just as many permutations. I want to tell you some of the major solutions that have been offered, and then the solution I'm going to choose as we study Luke. And then I want to tell you why I'm doing that. Okay, I'm going to have a sip of tea here. See my cup? I'm still on. Okay. Yorkshire Gold for my Brits. In the 19th century, where in Germany in particular, where the historical critical method originates and where it is taken to its furthest reaches, and it's stunning to watch German scholarship dissect the New Testament. I mean, down into its muons and gluons, down into its DNA. And they are very, very good at that. What they're not good at is then going back out to the big picture. But they, in the 19th century, it was a German by the name of Holtzmann who came up with the argument that Matthew and Luke used Mark, but they used a common source. And at that time, it wasn't called Q, it was called L or M. That was another letter in the alphabet, for it stood for a German term. But after the English, in the turn of the 20th century, under William Sandy's Synoptic seminar, and I believe that's at Cambridge University, they do their work, and that work is very oriented to the language of these New Testament writers. And there's a scholar at this time. You have to imagine this is pre really early automobile, early telephone, telegraph. There's no computers. This is all done pen and paper, okay? Writes this little thin book called Horae Synoptica. It means spending hours in the Synoptic Gospels. And all this is, it's just astonishing, is tables. I don't know if you can see this or not. It's tables and charts of words. How many times are found in Mark? How many times in Matthew? How many times in Luke? How many times in John? How many times in the combined material between Matthew and Luke? On and on and on. It's they're just counting words. And one of the things that they conclude as a result of all of this is that there are these two sources. This is known as the two-source theory of the synoptic tradition, Mark and Q. And Matthew and Luke both use Mark and Q. Now, this view was concretized into the four-source hypothesis in the 1930s in a book called The Four Gospels by B.F. Streeter. Streeter argued that you had Mark and you had Q. Q is the common material in Matthew and Luke, okay? Whenever stuff occurs in Matthew and Luke, and only in Matthew and Luke, that's attributable to Q. Then you have Mark. Well, we know the stuff that's found in Mark, in Matthew, and Luke. Then there's a source for Matthew called M. And that M source is material that's peculiar to Matthew. And then Luke has his own source called L. That's all the material peculiar to Luke. Now, the four-source hypothesis has been critiqued. It's not universally accepted. Markan priority is still fairly unanimously accepted, but there are some pretty big guns that have been coming at it the last 30 years. That Q exists is not a certainty. And there's still a lot of debate about this, although many PhDs have been minted in universities across the country and probably around the world of students who take this hypothetical document and then try to break it down into layers and discuss the community as it's forming through its layers. It's just some of the silliest work. It just really reminds me, it would be like if New Testament scholars were superstitious charismatics, this is how they would do their work. That's really what it amounts to, in my opinion. I have never been a believer in Q. It's a completely constructed hypothetical document that's really not necessary. And I'll show you why. The Catholic hypothesis that Matthew writes first, then Luke will use Matthew, and then Mark will summarize the two, is known as the Griesbach hypothesis. The alternative to that is known as the Farrar hypothesis, and that is that Mark writes first, Matthew uses Mark, Luke uses Matthew and Mark and another source. Now that's the hypothesis that I'm going to accept. I've finally decided that it's time to come down on a hypothesis in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, the reason I did that is I'm looking to be able to do several things. One, Occam's razor applies here. The simplest solution is probably the correct solution. When it comes to looking at, for example, and the French New Testament scholars are amazing at this. They'll have Mark and Q, and they'll have Matthew and Luke, and then they've got these other sources. So before the canonical Gospel of Mark, there's an Ur Marcus, and they'll try and recreate that as though it exists, and they try to break out all these various sources. And so when you come to a French introduction to the synoptic problem, you think you're looking at a Picasso, because they've got sources here and this connecting here and that connecting there, and it's mind-boggling. Okay, it's so complex that it's hard to accept. The simpler something is, the easier it is to accept. Theories are simple. E equals mc squared. Theories are simple. And so, since I do not think that Matthew's gospel is first, nor is Mark a summary, I'm left, and I don't accept Q, I'm left with being able to say, Mark writes first, Matthew midrashes on Mark, and I'm going to talk about, even though we're going to be going through Luke, we're going to be talking about all three gospels, but primarily we're focused on what Luke is doing, because if Matthew uses Mark, one of the things we know about Matthew's community is A, they're Jewish Christian, B, they're in the East, where Mark was also produced in the region of what is now Syria, Damascus, Antioch, in the rural areas in particular there. These two texts contain a very strong Jewish element when it comes to issues of halakha, issues of how to behave, okay? Matthew is a midrash on Mark, okay? Luke is going to have both Mark and Matthew. So we don't need a Q. Where does Luke's so-called common material with Matthew come from? It comes from Matthew. Then there is a third source that I think becomes very, very important here. This would be a thesis elaborated by James Edwards. I've mentioned it before. Where's his book? I have his book here. Here it is. A book that when I first read it, I had to actually sit down and read it again. The thesis itself was so strong. I felt like I needed to read it again. I thought I was getting snookered You know what I mean? And so the book is The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition by James Edwards. It's an Erdman's publication. What Edwards, in my opinion, is able to demonstrate is that there was, in fact, a text written in Hebrew known as the Hebrew Gospel. And it's that text that gets attributed to Matthew in the tradition. Papias will say Matthew wrote the gospel in his language of Hebrew. That's not the Matthew's gospel. We're talking the Hebrew gospel here. Now, the Hebrew gospel is quoted more times by the early church fathers than any other text, and with reverence. That is, it's recognized that what's in the Hebrew gospel has, as it were, apostolic roots or origins. We do not possess a text of the Hebrew gospel. That doesn't mean it's not sitting in the Vatican archive somewhere, but we don't know about it, okay? And we have to reconstruct it. So how do we reconstruct it? Well, we take the sayings of the early church fathers, and we take all the special material in Luke, and now we can begin to frame that and see, in fact, an early gospel narrative. And there's some very, very interesting things that go on in the Hebrew gospel that we'll see right away that are very, very different than Matthew. So, for example, as we get into the birth narratives, have you ever wondered why Matthew and Luke have very different birth narratives? Well, in fact, Matthew's community in the East, where the Hebrew Gospel's also going to be produced, they both, even though they are neighbors, have very different birth narratives. Very different. What's in common is the virginity of Mary. That's what's held in common. But other than that, those narratives are completely different. And if, in fact, Luke does have as a source the Hebrew gospel, then we are able to sit and work with Luke's hermeneutical use of both of Mark and Matthew and the Hebrew gospel. So now we are able to ask ourselves, what is Luke doing as he, for example, shortens Matthew's Sermon on the Mount? You ever read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7? It's full of all kinds of teaching of Jesus in there. But Luke will take that sermon, put it on a plain, first of all, not a mountain, but on a plain, and summarily reduce it to everything that's not especially oriented to Jewish halakhic issues. So, for example, all of the, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, all of that relates to Jewish Christians. Gentile Christians, they're not under the Torah. They're not reading the Torah in their church meetings. So there's no need for a, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. There's only a need for a, I say to you. And so we have this condensation of the Sermon on the Mount now for Gentiles. Same thing is happening when we look at any other any other text that Luke is going to be using. Now, I mention all of this to say that the historical critical method is going to be used here. However, anytime I use it, please put air quotes around it. Just like when we did the Christological paradigm, the textual Jesus, the Jesus of tradition, the Jesus of experience, the historical Jesus has air quotes around it. The reason for that is, in New Testament scholarship, things change, and they change dramatically and they change radically. And there's been a lot of water under the bridge with regard to the historical critical method in the last 350 years. In 1972, Walter Wink declared it bankrupt in his book, The Bible and Human Transformation. And there's a recent book my friend Chris Tilling has turned me on to. I can't get it. It's like $100 on Kindle. That really reproaches the historical, critical method. But that has also been done by folks from every stream, Catholic and Protestant, liberal and conservative. The historical critical method as a method has been overused and abused. And it's primarily its abuse that has created more problems for those that want to think within that framework than anything else. As we understand the category of what constitutes the historical, as we've moved into our postmodern world, one of the things we've done is to essentially be suspicious of anything that can claim some sort of connection to reality. We've unmoored ourselves so that history is whatever we want it to be. The winner writes the history, as it's said. And there's truth in that, okay? But it's not the whole truth. Because if it was, then you wouldn't be able to have history written from the underside, as we have for 2,000 years since the cross, from the perspective of the victim, which becomes a very important part of our larger hermeneutic. Having said that, and Walter, as you know, was a friend of mine, I want to use the historical critical method this way. We have already looked at the issue of Antioch, the split between Paul and the Jerusalem church. That split, in my perspective, looms large over everything that is written after 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and that is everything else, okay? 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are still written when Paul's enthralled to that Second Temple Jewish eschatology, but everything else written after that is either a reaction to Paul or an affirmation of Paul or a reaction to the very thing Paul's arguing against. So in other words, it would be pro-Pauline if it knew Paul. And I'm referring to the Johannine literature here. So it's that event that creates all this literature in early Christianity. It's that event coupled with the destruction of the temple. See, the destruction of the temple, as we'll see, it does loom large in the New Testament, even if it's given just simply brief bits in the prophecies of Jesus. It looms large because with the destruction of the temple, Jewish Christianity lost its influence. It was no longer able to send missionaries out into the diaspora. It retreated into the east, and the churches became Gentilized, if that's a word. Somebody's trying to call me again. I'm going to ignore it. So if you keep this in mind, here's what I want to suggest. If Luke is using Matthew, if Matthew is a rewrite of Mark, we have to ask, what is Mark's relation to Paul? What is Matthew's relation to Paul? What is Luke's relation to Paul? Now, good argument can be made that, in fact, Mark, the writer of the first gospel, this John Mark, this Libyan Christian, would be both a companion of Paul, but we know he leaves Paul in the book of Acts, breaks Paul's heart. John Mark splits, ends up in Peter's camp. Now, remember, Papias, some 70 years later, is saying, hey, John Mark was Peter's interpreter. He took what Peter said and wrote it down. What's really intriguing here is that when you read the Gospel of Mark in Greek, as opposed to Matthew and Luke, the Gospel of Mark in Greek records Jesus doing, everything's in the present tense, and Jesus is coming into the house, and Jesus is speaking to the disciples, and Jesus is healing the mother-in-law, and Jesus. It's called the historic present, but it's all in the present tense. Matthew and Mark turn those into aorists or past tenses, and Jesus came into the house, and Jesus spoke. So Mark's very language, it's as though it's vivid. It's as though he's hearing it, he's writing it down as he's hearing it. Okay, so there's some something to be said for Papias' statement that John Mark was Peter's interpreter, and it may well have been. But by the time the Gospel of Mark is written, most likely in and around 70 CE, at the end of the war, the temple is being destroyed. The remnants at Masada are still going to battle for a few years, but basically Jerusalem has been demolished. This gospel is written, okay, and it's all about the temple. And that is Bob Hamilton Kelly's thesis in the book, The Sacred and Violence, I think, on poetics in the Gospel of Mark. Anyway, you can look that up if you're interested. Matthew's gospel still assumes a standing temple. So Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount can say, if you have something against your brother, leave your gift at the altar, go to your brother and be reconciled. Matthew still presupposes a standing temple, even though it's not there. Luke records the destruction of this temple in chapter 21 with some very, very what's known as post-event knowledge. That is, he's writing what happened with the actual siege there of Jerusalem. So the three authors have a relation to Paul and the temple. Mark tends toward being pro-Pauline. For example, in Mark chapter 7, Jesus in Mark 7 has a dispute with the Pharisees, and he declares all foods clean. Now, that's a very Pauline perspective. Matthew copies that text from Mark and eliminates that saying, because for Matthew, all foods aren't clean. Luke comes along and it gets restored. It's a pro-Pauline approach. Okay, so you have Mark, who's pro-Paul, Matthew, who appropriates Mark, but now within a framework of dealing with Jewish Christians that are being persecuted by both, primarily by other Jews. And then you have this gospel, Matthew, becoming extremely popular. So Luke will use it and quarry it and produce his gospel. Here's the thing. When Luke quarries Matthew, just as Jesus quarried the Old Testament, when we see Jesus use Isaiah in Luke 4, when Jesus quarries that saying, he omits the saying of the day of the vengeance of our God. In the same way, Luke will quarry Matthew and omit a lot of the vengeance stuff that's added to Matthew, that's not found in Mark. But Matthew has added it. Well, there's a reason why that's there in Matthew. And then Luke has taken it out again. So we are watching a hermeneutic process develop historically in the gospel tradition. Okay? Does that make sense to you? So what are we going to conclude here just for today? Number one, the synoptic problem will never be solved. It just can't be. There's just too many things that go on when you frame a hypothesis that you're going to use. Then somebody's going to come along and say, yeah, well, what about the arrangement of the order of the pericope? What about Luke's using Q, and his sayings are easier to turn back into Aramaic? Matthew has expanded sayings and they're better Greek. You know, if Matthew was Jewish? Shouldn't it be the other way around? This, that, and the other. So there's all kinds of debates that these scholars will have. Well, rather than trying to figure out my own synoptic solution, it just seemed better to me, if I'm going to start with this perspective of Paul versus Jerusalem Christianity, two gospels, that we can play this theme out. Now, there's a piece here of research that I did when I was working with James Edwards' books. Here's what I did. We all know that Marcion had a version of Luke where he just was cutting things out. Just, excuse me, somebody's trying to reach me incessantly. Okay, I hope it stays on the same recording. I'm sorry. That phone just kept ringing and ringing. At first, I thought it was an emergency, but it's not. The synoptic problem will not be solved. So I chose a solution that I thought would help us to understand the development of the gospel tradition, number one, and number two, that it would allow us as, in a sense, Pauline Christians, because we're Protestants, to look at the way an early gospel writer framed the story of Jesus by engaging the story of Jesus that had been framed back within the context of the law. Okay. I would use the word mythologized if I was a mimetic theorist, but it's Matthew's gospel that imports a number of themes, particularly eschatological violence, that Mark doesn't have and that Luke eliminates, and that you don't find in the post-Thessalonian Paul or the fourth gospel at all. So with that, we can now have a conversation around these particulars. Yeah, I have a ton of books here on my table, but I'm not going to do any referring to them right now today. So we'll end this here.